Hi, this is Dr. Balkan Devlin. I'm a senior fellow at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, where I lead the transatlantic program. And welcome to A Better Future, How the West Can Support Democracy in Belarus and Russia. I'm very pleased to have 5 great panelists today to discuss this very important topic. As you all know, in the past couple of years, both Lukashenko's regime in Belarus and Putin's regime in Russia increased their intimidation and repression of democracy and human rights activists. Putin's most notorious act was the poisoning of the opposition leader Alexander Navalny, but his increasing repression of free media, civil society institutions, and other democracy and human rights activists increased in the past couple of years, leading to the parliamentary elections this September. Alexander Lukashenko, after losing the election in August 2020, faked the results, claimed a presidency, and started a crackdown against the democratic opposition, who actually won the elections, and started increasing its repression to the level that including the hijacking of an international airliner to kidnap a civil society activist. In response, the European Union and other allies imposed sanctions on Lukashenko, and he responded by engaging in political subversion and warfare against the neighboring countries, primarily Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. But not all is lost. We do have brave men and women on the ground struggling for a free and democratic Russia and Belarus, and we do have allies on the ground, right at the front lines, supporting a more democratic and free Belarus and Russia. Today, I'm very pleased to join by 5 excellent panelists who have real on-the-ground experience, who in a way, to a skin in the game, that have real life experience on the struggles when it comes to democracy and human rights. I'm joined today by Hanna Lyubakova, a journalist and a non-resident fellow from the Atlantic Council, Maria Logan, a trustee of the Future of Russia Trust, who has extensive experience with regards to democracy and human rights when it comes to Russia. Ambassador Einars Semanis, who is the Latvian ambassador to Belarus, but right now based in Riga, and Ambassador Darius Vitkauskas, who is the ambassador at large at the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is responsible for relations with the Belarusian civil society more broadly. And last but not least, Marcus Kolga, a senior fellow at the MLI, and who is one of the leading experts and advocates for human rights and democracy here in Canada. I'm very pleased to have these excellent panelists today to discuss how the West can support both our allies who are at the front lines dealing with the Lukashenko's and Putin's regime, as well as those brave women and men on the ground fighting for a free and democratic country. We will be proceeding in 2 rounds. In the first round, I would want the panelists to talk about 5 minutes each by diagnosing the situation, what is going on right now on the ground. And in the second round, we will be talking about the prescription, what can be done to support both the allies and the democracy and human rights activists on the ground. And in the remaining time, we will open up the floor for the audience questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Without further ado, I'll first like to give the floor to Maria to tell us a little bit about the situation on the ground, particularly when it comes to civil society, free media, as well as democracy activists. Putin's regime increasingly engaged in a crackdown leading up to the parliamentary elections. in September, and you have firsthand experience with that. What is going on right now? Why Putin is increasingly not intolerant of any dissent, even from former sort of regime-friendly forces, and increase its intimidation and repression.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Balkan. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. So, and tell you more about what's been going on in Russia and the civil society in Russia. So, has been a few very challenging years for us in Russia. Starting with the last year with the constitutional changes, which essentially allowed Putin to allow himself to run for another 2 terms and rule Russia as a czar until 2036 or even more. And yesterday is only 2021, and he's already been there for over 21 years. So we have potentially a few more years with him. So then, COVID, which, as we know, hasn't been a very good experience on anyone around the world. And when it comes to democracy, more limitations, more restrictions, and dictators like Putin and Lukashenko clearly use this into the advantage to limit civil society space under the auspices of COVID. Then we have, return of Navalny, poisoning of Navalny last year, return of Navalny this year, protests, crackdown, new wave of crackdown on civil society, political activists, any sort of critiques or opponents of the regime, of Kremlin, of Putin personally. And I can talk more about this in a second. Then it's all culminated in September in yet another non-election, and I want to stress non-election because you can't call what happened in September a true democratic elections. So Putin wanted his ruling party, United Russia, to win. They did win. Everyone knows their numbers are down, but nevertheless, Putin got its way again. So they're the ruling party again, and he has a very, very loyal Duma now that is going to allow him to do whatever he wants in 2024 when he's up for another election, if he decides to take on another term, again, under this new constitution. In the past year, I think over 100, probably 200 very active members of the civil society had to leave Russia. That includes Navalny's network, members of Navalny's network, Open Russia network, and many, many other representatives of NGOs that's been targeted sort of in this campaign by Kremlin leading up to this non-elections in September to basically sweep away, clean the field, as we say in Russia, for any criticism, any opposition around the election time or non-election time in September. So I would say that the civil society democracy in Russia is under siege. We have this set of rules and laws that's been sort of put in place over the past couple of years, starting with the law on undesirable organizations, foreign agency law, extremism law. The application of extremism law now extends to anyone who wants to, oppose Kremlin, wants to oppose Putin and the regime. So the entire Navalny's network, including his media platform, his investigative platform, been designated as an extremist groups, which means that if you want to donate 1 ruble or 10 rubles or whatever, it doesn't really matter how much, you are now an accomplice to an extremist group. So, and potentially, there is a prison sentence down the road. So this is the way they cut off any supporters from organizations organizations like Navalny's group. I mentioned the law on undesirable organizations. That's another tool, repressive tool, that's been put in place back in 2016, which allows the government basically designate any foreign organization, any foreign foundation, anyone who is supporting civil society abroad by virtue of inviting them to the events, providing funds, grants, or even collaborating in any way, to call them, to call these organizations undesirable, and again cut the links between Western partners or people-to-people dialogue and the Russian civil society. Foreign agency law, another repressive tool that's been sort of improved by Kremlin over the years. So from the beginning of this year, it's not just the organization, like an NGO typically can be designated as foreign agent. Now anyone, any individual who lives in Russia can be designated, a Russian citizen can be designated as a foreign agent, which essentially means for the public that you work for the interest of the foreign government, mainly United States, maybe European Union, United Kingdom, maybe even Canada. So if you receive funds from abroad or you collaborate in any way with the foreign organizations, you now have to go and declare to the government that you are the foreign agents, put the star, on your chest and say, I'm the foreign agent. And any media that mentions your name, for example, like Lev Ponomarev, who is a very well-known human rights defender, they designated him as one of the first group of individuals as foreign agents. So now every time he says something in the media, independent media, mentions his name, they have to put a disclaimer, calling him a foreign agent. Obviously, this doesn't really help civil society being part of the society and work in the society at large, because all of a sudden you are like a traitor, you're like a spy, and that's what foreign agent means today in Russia. So the other new trick, or the other new wave of repressions are now concerned a lot of journalists and media organizations. So until this year, I would say there were instances or incidents where members of the media, journalists, were attacked personally. This year we have a new wave, where I don't know which independent media. I think Echo Moskvy is the only one left. Maybe Novaya Gazeta. I don't know who else. But almost every independent media platform has been put on the list of foreign agents. So as a result, they essentially can no longer work in Russia, because every time they publish, they have to put a disclaimer: we're foreign agents. And there are all sorts of repressive rules that come along this designation. You have to report your all your income, all your revenues, and all your spending, and the government wants to know what you do with that money, how you spend, which obviously for a lot of people is a non-starter.
Excellent.
So the journalists been hit, and some people believe that it's going to get better after these non-elections, but I don't believe we're going to see any improvements.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and we'll get to what can we do to prepare for the long term and support these people who are still struggling and fighting for in these difficult circumstances. And I think there's also the notion that these dictators do learn from each other. There's a lot of emulation going on, and they're improving, unfortunately, on the way they engage in the repression. Now I'd like to turn to Hannah to take your view, your diagnosis of the situation that is going in Belarus since the fake elections that Lukashenko claimed that he won, but he actually lost back in August 2020. Belarusian civil society and Belarusian people more broadly really take to the streets, led by women, and I think was quite an inspiration for a lot of people across the world. And Lukashenko basically sort of disregard any even the pretensions of legitimacy and engage in naked repression, forced disappearances and kidnappings and detentions and all other including sort of exit visa requirements and all sorts of tools to control and oppress the legitimate party that actually won the elections. What is going on right now? I mean, what is the situation? You're following it closely. Give us a little bit of an insight of the things on the ground.
Of course. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this timely and important discussion. So I'm often being asked whether Lukashenko is scared or he feels strong. And I think the current level of repressions in Belarus actually shows us that he is very uncertain about his position, that he does not feel confident at all. If we look at the numbers of those people who were repressed, these are nearly 40,000 people who were detained since August. These are 4,500 claims of torture that human rights defenders were able to report. There are currently more than 800 people in jail recognized as political prisoners, but there are many more. And this is obviously, this might be very hard to imagine, but when I try to explain that, I usually say that nearly everyone I know in Belarus, I work with, are now either in jail or fled the country or just went into hiding. And when we look at the situation with civil society, this is actually, the level of repressions is again unprecedented. There are currently almost 300 organizations that were dissolved, that were liquidated in Belarus. These are like NGOs, right? All sorts of independent organizations that existed in Belarus, environmental and so on. So different, really kind of unpolitical even organizations. It's kind of good to know that there were so many of them in Belarus, but on a serious note, obviously this is a catastrophic situation. When we look at media, now there are currently literally no independent media outlet that focused on politics, that reported on the political situation that is still in Belarus. So kind of whole newsrooms were pushed out of the country. Journalists have been jailed. My friends and my colleagues are in jail. And obviously the consequences of such situation, of kind of when the media field, when the ecosystem of civil society is being destroyed, are very hard to predict. When there is no truthful information, people will just won't know what's happening in the country, and this kind of connection between officials and the society is being lost right now. The information is becoming more fragmented, and obviously there is polarization, which is another really kind of difficult topic and really important issue to discuss. But also when the kind of ecosystem of media, civil society is destroyed, it's also easier for foreign organizations, foreign narratives being spread in Belarus, and now I mean mostly Russia. So this situation is really difficult. However, there is a lot of hope. Now kind of people who are still on the ground, activists, those people in local neighborhoods who are still active, who are trying to self-organize as much as they can, they create this important experience of horizontal connections, this kind of activities on the ground, this local government, I would say. That's something that might become important in the future, this kind of feeling of community, this mobilization and kind of this local governance in the future are something that might lead to that. Now, workers, there are currently 16,000 workers who signed up for this workers' movement. A nationwide strike is really hard to organize. Nevertheless, these people are still united. They apply this work to rule practices at work. They share information with the democratic forces about the situation. There are also cyber partisans, which is a new phenomenon, but they also leak databases. They de-anonymize security forces. That's something that really scares those people because they want anonymity. They don't want to be recognized. So these kind of pressure, both external and internal, are important. That's something that might actually lead the regime to agree to negotiate. Lukashenko is not able to propose any solution, but I wouldn't say that oligarchs or businesses, large businesses or state-owned enterprises are happy about the status quo. They actually see that Lukashenko is not able to kind of resolve the crisis, political and human rights crisis in Belarus, and at some point they might actually think about sort of seeking this solution, looking for ways how to negotiate with the democratic forces. And really briefly, now I would say that Lukashenko has two main pillars of power. These are obviously Siloviki, security forces, and they're becoming more and more important. That's something that I call currently a police state, military junta in Belarus. They are in the government. They work on proposing legislation. They sort of now, most recently, there was this former KGB commander who was appointed as the one of the heads of the National Academy of Sciences, which is really bizarre. And obviously, Russia is another pillar of support for Lukashenko. Putin might not be a big fan of Alexander Lukashenko, but obviously Putin is interested in the status quo. Putin's nightmare is a free and democratic country, so that's something that Putin does not want to allow. What is missing here is that I would say that there are different moods in the Russian elite and even in the Russian society towards Belarus. So it does not mean that this support is kind of very monolithic and this support is kind of 100% is clear. So I do remain optimistic in the long run because, well, if we look at who protested for months, these were different social and gender and age groups in Belarus, which means that Lukashenko lost support in the society, among the society, and because of torture, because of all these violations in Belarus, there is no way back. Like, people want changes, and that's something that we also see in those sociological research that we have access to, that the majority want change, and again, right? So we just kind of need to apply more pressure and kind of the raw grounds for being optimistic in the long run, even though the situation right now looks very bad. So I will stop here, and I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this really sort of clear picture of what's going on, and which reminds me, when you talk about whether Lukashenko is very afraid of what's going on, just a day or two ago, saw this news about announcing a new sort of crop of security personnel, and they sort of blur their faces even on the sort of the state TV, which tells you that he and the Siloviki is not very happy or feel safe. And in these personalized dictatorships, like the one in Lukashenko as well as Putin's, their end tend to go towards a Praetorian system in which the security services took over, and that's generally quite destabilizing. These things look very stable until they're not, unlike one-party regimes. But they always have an international dimension. And now I want to turn to Einars to first talk about his own experience as an ambassador in exile, but also his take on the diplomatic situation, particularly when it comes to Belarus, and how we will then later on get what Latvia is doing to deal with sort of the international consequences and dimension of Lukashenko's subversion.
Yes. Yes. Good afternoon from Riga. Good evening from Riga, I would like to say. It will be more precise. And thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar devoted to Belarus and Russia. And I am especially honored to be invited to this conference seminar because Canada is a framework nation to the NATO enhanced presence battle group to Latvia, which is a proof of very important transatlantic solidarity. So answering to the question which is put for the webinar, how to assist, what to do, the Latvian answer is that we call for the international community to be firm in its demand to Belarus to comply to its international obligations, to stop the brutal human rights violations and the inhuman policy of instrumentalizing people from third countries for political purposes. I guess that's the essence what we could see today. Hanna gave very good, I think, precise, it's better terminology, description of situation. I could not add much, but I would like to add one thing only, that by the end, it's in the hands of Belarusians themselves. How to create their fate and go forward. So we could assist, we could be helpful, especially neighboring countries maybe with our experience, but by then it's in the hands of Belarusians themselves. About diplomatic experience, what is going on? In fact, I think I am in an interesting case because I'm really ambassador in exile. So what it is? What does it mean? It is one of examples that diplomatic space for Western diplomats in Minsk, in Belarus, now is diminishing. It's limited by Lukashenko regime. I'm not the only ambassador in exile. So diplomatic activities are much, much more difficult, much more demanding. And there should be a lot of patience to work in Belarus today. What happened in reality and what is today? In Latvian embassy in Minsk, there are 2 employees. One is in Riga, that's me. And there is an administrative manager in Minsk, and that's all. But besides there is a consulate in Vitebsk, Latvian consulate, and Belarusian consulate in Daugavpils. On the 26th of May, I was invited by Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, Mr. McKay, who announced that I should leave Minsk in 24 hours. And other diplomats and employees of embassy, including their family members, they should leave during 48 hours. The reason which was announced by Belarusian side was a change of Belarusian flags in Riga during the World Championship of Hockey, from Belarusian official flag to Belarusian historical flag. The main reason, in essence, for the change of flags from Latvian side was the landing of Ryanair airplane by the Belarusian regime, and protest in general against repressions and human rights violations in Belarus. I am not person non grata. I could return to Belarus, but only it is in the case when there is normalization of relations between Latvia and Belarus. Understanding what is normalization is very, very different from both sides. Generally, we are 5 ambassadors in exile from European Union. It is a head of European Union delegation in Minsk from summer of this year. Polish ambassador, he's in Warsaw from October last year. Lithuanian ambassador, he has finished his term. Now there is a deputy head of mission in Vilnius, who is in exile, in fact. And a couple of days before, French ambassador left Vilnius. And there is a special envoy, US envoy for Belarus, who is in Vilnius. So that is the situation if we maybe put this exile situation. But to sum up, I should say that the diplomatic space is now in a way limited, and it is much more difficult. So about today's discussion, I think that it is timely discussion because really human rights situation in Belarus is bad, and the country's behavior in the region asks for immediate international attention and action. We could see that Belarusian regime is organizing massive arrivals of people from the third countries to Belarus. Regime is promising them the access to the European Union. They, in fact, have been lured into Belarus, and they face difficulties to return back to their home countries. That's the situation. And the regime is using threats to push them to cross the EU border illegally. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, Mr. Edgars Rinkēvičs, said during the ARIA special meeting on the 8th of October in the UN Security Council, I quote, "The main goal is to destabilize the European Union and the three neighboring EU countries in particular. This is a clear retaliation for us being decisive in our support to Belarusian civil society and for giving shelter and protection to Belarusian people demanding free and fair elections in their country." So, on the whole, not going in details, I should say, the regime is conducting a hybrid attack. And this operation of the Belarusian regime is accompanied by a very, very aggressive disinformation campaign to discredit Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and the EU on the whole, and to divert the attention from Lukashenko's government brutality against their own nation. Latvian government on the 11th of August introduced the emergency rule in the territory of 4 local governments in the border area with Belarus. And just now, this emergency rule was prolonged till the 10th of February. As to the statistics, from the 10th of August, 1,807 persons were prevented from the illegal border crossing. But 50 persons were allowed to cross the border because of humanitarian reasons, to provide medical assistance if there is a need to go to hospital and so on. On the total, during this year, around 402 persons were detained because of illegal border crossing. So Latvian Armed Forces, Police, and Frontex, which is an EU border agency, is providing an assistance. And if we speak directly about the situation today, I would like to take a look what Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia said on 18th of October, just now. And he said it during the European Union's Foreign Affairs Council in Luxembourg. In a discussion on the sanctions policy against the Belarusian regime, Edgars Rinkēvičs voiced an opinion that the European Union should continue to put pressure on Belarus and prepare the 5th round of sanctions, unless the situation at the external borders of the EU improves. Our message should remain clear. Sanctions against Belarus will be increased, including against the Belarusian national airlines, Belavia, and other Belarusian legal entities involved in the hybrid operations deployed by Belarus. We also rely on the European Commission support in the fight against disinformation. So Latvia calls on the international community to be firm in its demand to Belarus to comply with its international obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Einar. We'll get back to what can specifically Canada and others do in the second round. I'd like to turn to Darius right now. Lithuania have been at the forefront, both in terms of supporting civil society and democracy in Belarus and being very vocal about it. And as a result, has also been one of the major targets of Lukashenko's political warfare against the West, both in terms of the weaponization of migrants, but also with regards to disinformation campaigns. How does it look from your side, the situation? Give us a little bit more information about the challenges Lithuania is facing when it comes to the political warfare carried out by Lukashenko.
Yeah, hello from Vilnius. It's a pleasure to be a part of this great event. So I will start maybe from the describing situation in Belarus from Vilnius. Actually, Lithuania as a neighboring country, we are very worried about unprecedented repressions, human rights abuses, and further deteriorating situation in Belarus. The actions of the regime from the August last year showed how far the regime had distanced itself from the common democratic values and principles. Since the beginning of the political crisis in the country, the authorities have been trying to create a kind of cult of law enforcement agencies, power structures. According to their logic, everything that does not depend on the state is a threat and must be eliminated. The Belarusian regime is creating an absolutely repressive state where the main resource is the use of force, the use of power. So to speak, manual control of the country. Impunity of repressive structures is rampant. It's a very sad reality. So on the actions of Belarus towards its western or northern neighbors, I would start by saying that the complicated geopolitical code is to live next to authoritarian and unpredictable neighbor. And Belarusian authorities are dangerous for its neighbors as well as for its own people. Lukashenko regime uses migration as a weapon to exert pressure, deliberately directs migrants to the Lithuanian border in retaliation to the EU support for the Belarusian democratic forces and the EU sanctions. And Lithuania was the first target of those actions, directed to destabilize the domestic situation in Lithuania and I would say incite contradictions within the European Union. And so far, there are no signs of the escalation of the situation, and we are finding more and more evidence of the involvement of Belarusian state structures in organizing this, pushing migrants across the border. As of today, more than 4,000 migrants are found and apprehended in Lithuania. That means it's 56 times more than in last year, in 2020. As my Latvian colleague said, the influx of illegal migrants is accompanied by a massive propaganda campaign about alleged inhuman treatment of migrants. But at the end of the day, we see that after Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland strengthened efforts to prevent illegal migration, thousands of migrants are wandering across Belarus now. So, forceful landing of Ryanair civilian plane, military exercises, Zapad, construction of Ostrovets nuclear power plant, expulsion of Lithuanian diplomats from Belarus. There are only a few examples, to put it mildly, unfriendly behavior from the side of current Belarusian authorities. So maybe I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Darius. And for the audience, just to put the numbers in perspective, Lithuania is about 2.8 million, I think, in terms of population, and Latvia is about 2 million. So the combined population of these two countries are less than GTA, and they're facing this massive, comparatively speaking, massive migrant forced migration, and the weaponization of that by the regime to intentionally destabilize these countries. So it is important to sort of put the numbers and to recognize the enormity of the problem that these two allies of Canada are facing. Now, I'd like to turn to Marcus. Marcus, you're one of the leading voices when it comes to human rights advocacy here in Canada, and an expert, one of the leading experts on disinformation. You're also you have been on the other side of the Kremlin's intimidation and efforts to silence you. So you have first-hand information and experience with these. Give us your perspective from covering perhaps both Russia and Belarus, and the situation on the ground and what Canada is doing.
Sure. Thanks, Balkan, first of all for moderating this important discussion and for that kind introduction. And to all of my fellow panelists today, it's great to see some familiar faces here. As you mentioned, I want to zoom out, rather zoom in, and take a look at sort of what the situation has been like in Canada, what Canada has been doing, and more importantly, sort of what it hasn't been doing with regards to supporting Russian civil society and Belarusian civil society. If we look at the state of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Russia from a Canadian perspective over the past decade or more, we see dramatic oscillations in terms of real action and policy. The pool of Canadian experts on Russia is pretty limited. And some of the most prominent voices are former diplomats and academics, some of whom actually benefit from appointments to Kremlin-supported trade organizations in Canada, and a few have even been appointed to the boards of Russian mining companies. Canada's Bombardier, the large train and airplane manufacturer, has also influenced Canada's Russia policy. For years, Bombardier was entwined in a toxic relationship with Russian railways, while Vladimir Yakunin, a close Putin associate, of course, was its chairman. That relationship was investigated in Sweden as a result of some rather shady deals in Azerbaijan. And it's also been widely reported that Yakunin avoided being placed on Canada's sanctions list due to lobbying by Bombardier. Within this mix are also those who genuinely believe that the Putin regime will listen to Canada if we just put down our stick and speak to Putin slowly and calmly. Overall, the Canadian government's approach to Russia has shifted between one that is tough and principled, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and back to one guided by principles when Parliament approved Canada's Sergei Magnitsky Law in 2017, which was supported by all of Canada's political parties. So that's sort of the environment that we're in right now, and I think it's important to have that context when we discuss Canada's response to what's happening in Russia and Belarus today. Personally, I started advocating in Canada for the Russian pro-democracy opposition shortly after the violent murder of Anna Politkovskaya and the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. At the time, there was a belief in Canada that Russia was still in the process of reforming towards a democratic liberal democracy. Some people still believe that. In reality, Putin and his gang of crooks and thieves were, of course, robbing the country blind. Maria was, of course, at the center of the fight against Putin's kleptocrats at this time. Now, to punch through the false perceptions Canadians had about Putin, I organized and hosted an advocacy trip to Canada for Boris Nemtsov in 2012. Boris was an incredibly charismatic opposition leader and was deeply committed to improving the lives of Russians in terms of freedom, prosperity, and of course, human rights. On Magnitsky sanctions, Boris directly contradicted Canada's Canadian proxies who warned of the potentially catastrophic diplomatic fallout if Canada should follow the US lead in adopting Magnitsky human rights legislation. Instead, Boris told Canadian lawmakers at the time that adopting Magnitsky legislation was the most pro-Russian thing that they could do. After Boris's visit, Canadian media sought out opposition activists as part of the reporting on Russia, and the conservative government of the day started developing Magnitsky legislation. In the context of Belarus, Andrei Sannikov has been similarly helpful over the past years, advocating on behalf of the Belarusian pro-democracy movement and opposition. But efforts by the Kremlin and its proxies to steer the narrative about Russia and Belarus and Canada and silence criticism remain a fairly significant problem. As I mentioned earlier, trade promotion groups, they continue to lobby the current Canadian government against expanding our sanctions regime, while some Canadian academics actively contribute opinions to Russian state media, such as RT, questioning whether Putin is violating anyone's rights and accusing the critics of the Putin and Lukashenko regimes of being Russophobic. In terms of sanctions, Canada has failed to even keep up with our allies. Several prominent Russian kleptocrats are missing from our own Magnitsky list, including Yevgeny Prigozhin. In 2018, Marina Litvinenko, the widow of assassinated FSB whistleblower Alexander Litvinenko, asked me why her husband's killers had evaded Canada's Magnitsky list. I'm still asking that question in 2021. On Belarus, the news is perhaps a little bit better. In August of last year, Canada's Foreign Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, expressed support for the opposition movement and Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya after the Canadian Central and Eastern European community advocated for greater Canadian support. A commitment was also made to help fund some aspects of democratic development in Belarus, though it's unknown what projects have been funded so far. So overall, Canada's support for the Russian human rights and pro-democracy movement can be described as cautious, if not a bit timid. The fact that diplomats at Global Affairs have been instructed not to use Sergei Magnitsky's name when referring to Canada's Sergei Magnitsky law speaks volumes. And so I'll leave it there for right now.
Thank you for this rather depressing, but I think accurate overview of the situation in Canada. I think we started right, but didn't really sort of push through to the logical conclusion of what needs to be done when Canada recognized and I mean the majority of the Canadian political parties recognize the nature of Putin's regime and Lukashenko's regime. So I think it's important to continue to push for that. And we'll get to that when we talk about what needs to be done, which I want to turn right now in the second round. We talk about the diagnosis of the situation, what is going on, but right now I would like to ask the panelists, going with the same order. I would like to start with Maria to get their recommendations of what needs to be done, both to support democracy and human rights activists in Russia today and help them to prepare for the future, what Canada and the West more broadly can do to support these developments. Maria. You are muted.
Yes, sorry. I think we should listen to Marcus because he has the recipe. He just told us what Canada should do. But putting the jokes aside, Um, it's hard to recommend, specifically for Canadian government or Canadian society. So I would just go broadly, and say what I think is how the West, or how we in the democratic societies can help, Russian civil society. So, Lithuania has been doing this already for many years very successfully, and I want to congratulate, the guest today from Lithuania. You've been doing the right stuff for many years now, and it's been the support that the government of Lithuania have been providing to Russian activists, civil society, by opening its country, to forums, platforms for dialogue, people to people, various discussions, but also, directly supporting. I mean, there's an annual forum, Russia Forum, that's taking place in Lithuania, and it's been the place to go for a lot of Russian activists. Every year, and discuss in a very open space, the problems that they face in Russia on a daily basis. So thank you, and I think there needs to be more examples like this. Unfortunately, you read today about Belarusian crisis and the border crisis, and you just feel like it's not a good time to be a nice guy. So I just want to applaud you for being this nice guy and great neighbor, and I thank you for doing all this work. Thank you also to Latvia. I have to say, this situation with the flag, and there's been other symbolic gestures coming from the Latvian government recently, where I guess it's just enough is enough, and finally they're saying enough is enough, and making those gestures, in solidarity with the Russian activism, civil society, with Belarusian people, etc. I think it's extremely important to show these dictators that they are not, that their actions are not, right. They are not welcome, and undermine their legitimacy as, as we say. I think a lot of times the West, or the democracy, democratic countries, they still open up to these dictators like nothing is going on, accepting them as equal members to various clubs, international clubs. And I think it's time to stop this. I mean, we all talked, a lot about this thing. So what else can be done? Yes, there are a lot of people who are leaving Belarus, a lot of people leaving Russia. I don't know about specifics of Belarusian situation, but there's a lot of active people leaving Russia because they are afraid to go. They are afraid. Their threats of prison terms. I mean, we have several people in the network of Open Russia who are now in jail or under house arrest. So it's okay for them to leave, but then once they leave, where do they go and what do they do? So, and I think it's important to recognize that there's still things to be done from outside of Russia. And I think media projects, media platforms that existed in Russia are now left because of this foreign agency law, or the atmosphere generally. They can continue to work, they can continue to publish from outside, as long as Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are allowing us to use that channel of communication into the Russian society. I think it's possible to create content from outside of Russia. So we need to help these people to settle, relocate, provide them support. And again, I would applaud Lithuania for doing all of this work now with the very little resources that they have. So I think there needs to be more countries in the European Union, and maybe Canada. I don't know what Canada can do. But I think there's people who can, potentially settle in Canada and broadcast and publish from Canada. It doesn't really matter where you are. So that support, that on an individual basis, the care, opening up to these people and providing them with opportunities to continue their work from outside of Russia. And I think it's extremely, extremely important and is very urgent. So I encourage Canada to step in and learn from Lithuania and Latvia and help.
Thank you very much. And I think it's as you pointed out, it's very important to maintain that sort of infrastructure and momentum, and think in the long term, what is to come after Putin, and how the West could support the democratic forces in Russia as well as in Belarus for that day when these dictators are no longer in power. After all, they are also mortals. One hopes that they will not be around for forever. Hannah, I'd like to turn to you. You highlighted that you're still hopeful despite all the difficult circumstances under which the democracy and civil rights and human rights activists are working and maintaining those, or creating those grassroots and horizontal structures across the society, working in very, very difficult circumstances. What can the West do to support those people, to support that horizontal sort of grassroots structures, and prepare for a democratic and free Belarus?
Sure. But first of all, let me tell you, well, perhaps not a secret, but not quite a well-known fact. Lithuania and Canada have more in common than it might seem. The elected president, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, is currently based in Vilnius in Lithuania, but we have also another president, the president of the Rada of the Belarusian People's Republic, Ivonka Serviva, who is based in Canada, actually, for quite a number of years. So I hope that Canada will continue to support the Belarusian diaspora and such people want to Serviva, because well, the diaspora became really important during the revolution in Belarus. They've been collecting money for to support those who were repressed, to support media, to support striking workers. So this support, even this symbolic support to diaspora, is really important. I talked about civil society and the fact that it's currently being destroyed. Canada's role here has been very important for years. Canada is sort of well known for supporting projects in advancing democracy, projects in of media freedom, of women's participation in politics. Since last year, this support has increased to $3.5 million Canadian dollars, if I'm not mistaken. So this is very important, but unfortunately, this is not enough, because because of the catastrophic situation when it comes to civil society, we need more support, and this money won't go in vain. This money will be used to preserve structures, to preserve the ecosystem of civil society, and these are organizations that would actually restore the country when during the transition period. So when Belarus is free. We also need to make sure that this support actually is flexible and reflects the need of those who need this assistance, and kind of reach those organizations who are still on the ground, or also those organizations that had to flee the country. Pressure, I talked about internal and external pressure. Here, sanctions are important. I know that trade balance between Belarus and Canada is not that high, is not that important, but having this joint and coordinated sanctions, Canada, UK, EU, US, is really painful for the regime. It creates a lot of new dynamics inside the power vertical among those people in the system. So it is important. So Canada has a very strong voice in international organizations such as the UN and the OSCE. Most recently, kind of a number of countries that are not well known for democracy, such as Belarus, China, Russia, Venezuela, adopted passed this resolution at the UN Human Rights Council titled "Negative Impacts of the Legacies of Colonialism." So I think we need to respond with something similar. And when it comes to the UN, Canada can do a lot. For example, there is this mechanism, there is this idea of having an interstate complaint against Belarus at the UN Human Rights Committee. So Canadian voice is important here. When it comes to the OSCE, let's remember that there was this Moscow mechanism that was published last November, and these recommendations, we need to make sure that these recommendations of the Moscow mechanism report have been fulfilled, have been realized. Then when it comes to ICAO, Canada's voice can be also sort of crucial here. I hope that Canada can stress the importance of publishing the report about the diversion of the Ryanair flight in Minsk, kind of proceeding with the international mechanisms that could investigate, that could also kind of punish those involved in the flight diversion, because, well, again, this is this is really important. And here I have in mind the ICJ, for example, International Court of Justice, that might sort of look into this case and launch proceedings. So even symbolic steps are important. Let's be vocal about the situation in Belarus. Let's publish kind of comment in media about that. So this conference, this discussion is also important, because this is something that helps focus on the situation in Belarus. And more importantly, because Western countries did not recognize the election results last year, so let's think how we can actually proceed with negotiations, with mediation, with dialogue between the democratic forces and regime in Belarus. That's why I believe that the Belarusian crisis should become the priority for Western countries, because without a stable and predictable Belarus, there is no stability in Europe and no security in Europe, and Canada could also make a difference here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anna, for these very specific and comprehensive discussion on the diplomatic side, on the civil society side, on the government of Canada side, that what can be done. And I think this is extremely important to highlight. I'm personally a big fan of sort of targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions against the kleptocrats and the security forces, and making sure that they and their families cannot enjoy the ill-gotten gains that they got through repression and robbing their own people. So no more shopping trips to Paris or houses in London or Vancouver. That's, I think, the least we could do to make sure that they do not benefit from the suffering they inflicted upon their people. Einar, so I want to turn to you. You have discussed and pointed out in your remarks the importance of maintaining sanctions, going for the fifth round of that, and as well as making the international community stand up very clearly to what is going on in Belarus. What are your recommendations more broadly, how we can support, how the allies can support Latvia in its position and help Latvia to defend against particularly Lukashenko's political warfare?
Yeah. Thank you, Balkan. Answering in essence the question how we could assist civil society and democratic movement in Belarus. So I'm coming back what I said in the first part. Of course, we could use sanctions. We should use sanctions in this situation to be ready to do it. But in general, I think we should keep this issue of brutal violence of human rights in Belarus high on agenda in international organizations. I agree what Hanna was saying as well, that in this case, for example, OSCE is important, United Nations, of course, Council of Europe. There is one another initiative which is important here, and here we should be, I think, mobilizing our energy as allies. I think it is support to the international accountability platforms for Belarus. So it is important. And special attention, of course, should be paid, as other speakers on the panel mentioned, to the assistance and help and cooperation with diaspora, and especially to the communication of the leaders of Belarusian democratic movement, which are forced to live in exile. But in a very practical, maybe, I don't know, let's say diplomatic sense, I think that generally the assistance to the people who suffered during repressions is very important. And Latvia, we are paying special attention to it, and we think that other allies should take a look at these issues as well, and it is done, in fact. I think that it is medical aid, psychological support, legal assistance, scholarships, immediate help to the journalists and other media workers. So these issues are important. We are paying special attention to help as well IT companies from Belarus, which are relocating their business, in this case, for example, to Latvia. But as a Latvian citizen, as a diplomat, I am in fact proud that Latvian civil society itself is very, very active and demonstrates its solidarity and engagement here. So an important role, of course, it plays that Latvia is a neighboring country because with Belarus, because there are horizontal links, there are long-term cooperation links, and it helps in this case. Some examples what we are doing, some facts which maybe could be useful in this session. For example, as to asylum seekers from Belarus, this issue was raised by other speakers as well. By the end of September this year, refugee status was granted to 38 persons, but alternative status to 13 persons. These status humanitarian visas, they are free of charge, were granted to 269 persons. As to civil society, assistance to civil society as such, for example, such civil society organization as Latvian Platform for Development Cooperation, together with their Belarusian partners, provided legal assistance in 3,033 cases. And they did documentation of 310 episodes of violence and torture. Organization Center Marta provided medical and psychological assistance as well, and organized the training of Belarusian specialists in psychology. The Baltic Media Center, the Baltic Media Excellence Center, is very important in this cooperation. And not only them, but Latvian Journalists Association, because they really help assist to Belarusian journalists, and they provide psychological assistance, rehabilitation. They use online tools of psychological assistance. It was provided to 132 Belarusian journalists. There was provided medical assistance and so on. So scholarships, they are important. And in this case, for example, I could mention only some of our universities, but I appreciate what they're doing, and it's a good example as well. For example, Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences grants 100% discount for the tuition fee to all students from Belarus. So the Riga Stockholm School of Economics helps a lot. Daugavpils University provides scholarships for researchers and lecturers. And the Riga Law School, where there is a program where Belarusian mid-career level participants are enrolled, and it was mentioned as well during discussion, how to look at post-transition time and so on, and this is important in this case. So other organizations are doing programs which are oriented towards assistance to local communities, to develop citizens' participation skills, and so on, or implementing the projects which assist to the development of social entrepreneurship in Belarus, and so on, so on. So this is important, and this is important direction when we take a look how to assist to civil society, how to assist to democratic movement, and so on. And as I mentioned, communication to the leaders of the Belarusian opposition, which are forced to live abroad. For example, Franak Večorka, who is from Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya's bureau in Vilnius, he just was a guest and speaker in Riga conference, which was happening by the end of the last week. So, and there was a special section on Belarus. Therefore, today's conference as well is important to put these issues high on the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview of how Latvia provides support for civil society and democracy movement in Belarus. And I agree that we should be, in addition to the diplomatic pressure and sanctions on the regime, need to engage with the those who are actually struggling in Belarus for democracy and freedom, and support them and give voice to their concerns and keep this on the agenda. Darius, I'd like to turn to you now. As several of the speakers pointed out, Lithuania is very active and very vocal in its support for democracy in the region, and particularly with regards to Belarus, and provided support and refuge for those who are escaping from oppression. What can the West and Lithuania's allies can do to support these activities, as well as push back against the Lukashenko's political warfare against Latvia, against Lithuania, against Poland that is going on?
Yeah, actually, in more broader terms, I would say that there are a few fundamental principles Western democracy should follow. That is support of civic society and continuous sanctions towards regime. It's important to further support civil society, its initiatives, because it has proved its effectiveness. It proved meaningful and to be meaningful and viable during the events of the last year, during the protest in 2020, when Belarusians perceived themselves as a really political nation. So the Western democracies, Western democratic community should help create conditions for the Belarusian people to choose the future of their own country, and support Belarusian people on their demand to hold new free and fair elections. As was mentioned by my colleagues, of course, supporting independent media is also an issue of paramount importance, because it is relevant. It's a really need to provide alternative narratives for citizens beyond state's propaganda and disinformation. I also would like to highlight the need of, so to speak, oxygen inside of Belarus. I mean, projects that support projects that are directed to the people inside of Belarus, trade unions, as I mentioned, independent media channels. So it's very, very, very important. So, of course, I mentioned also sanctions, and in this terms, solidarity and consensus among Western democracies on joint actions against Lukashenko regime are important, not to play Lukashenko's zero-sum games on his conditions as it was previous. So it is also very important to support on the ongoing efforts in collecting, consolidating, verifying, and preserving information, documentation, evidences the regime crimes, serious violations of international human rights law committed in Belarus for the future criminal prosecutions. So, and in Lithuania, Lithuania-based NGO, so-called Justice Hub, is also dealing with this topic in collaboration and cooperation with Accountability Platform for the international investigation into regime's crimes against humanity. So, and I think the Canadian voice is very important also on this topic. Speaking about more precisely about Lithuanian action, I have to say that after the brutal crackdown of protest of civic society in August last year, Vilnius has become the most important capital for the work of Belarusian civic society. And thank you, Maria, for nice words addressing to Lithuania for the support vis-a-vis Belarusian civic society and its project. It's also very important. So many Belarusian NGOs and civil society organizations, independent journalists that cannot operate in Belarus, they are here in Lithuania now. In Vilnius has settled down the office of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, the leader of Belarusian democratic forces. So maybe our partners in Western democracies should follow also this example on opening Belarusian people's offices or representations. In September last year, Lithuanian government approved the plan of support for the people of Belarus. And the plan includes the measures like aid for victims of repression, treatment and rehabilitation, support for science and studies, civil society initiatives, media, legal assistance, facilitating procedures for issuing national visas, and many other things. Also, government of Lithuania allocated about 100 scholarships for Belarusian students to study at Lithuanian universities. This is also, I think, a pattern some countries, democratic countries, should follow. Well, European Humanities University, functioning in exile in Vilnius, is the only Belarusian university granting academic freedom for its students. So the EHU, the European Humanities University, is even more important nowadays because of repressions, expulsions of students and lecturers in Belarus. So I think there are a lot of spheres where the Western democracies should and could join their efforts in order to help Belarusian civic society. So I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Darius. I think this is really sort of the both all the panelists actually pointed out quite nicely the specifics that needs to be done and to support both the people on the ground as well as our allies. Marcus, I'd like to turn to you now. You have provided us what Canada has been doing, but now what should Canada do, both when it comes to dealing with the Lukashenko's regime, as well as its enabler, Putin, but also in terms of supporting our allies, who we just heard both Latvia and Lithuania doing a lot to support the civil society and democracy in Belarus and elsewhere. What should Canada do?
Well, you're right. I mean, Latvia and Lithuania really are doing a lot to support the pro-democracy and opposition movements in Russia and Belarus. And I think we've gone over a lot of really good suggestions as to how we can continue doing that. I'm going to drill down specifically on 3 things that Canada needs to start doing immediately. And that's first is to fully implement our Magnitsky sanctions regime against the Putin and Lukashenko regimes. This includes expanded resources for enforcement and reforms that include the ability to redistribute seized assets to victims. As I mentioned earlier, Canada has failed to even come up with or to rather keep up with our allies in placing the most notorious and corrupt human rights abusers on our list. We should be actively consulting with Russian and Belarusian journalists and civil society leaders about who we should be targeting with sanctions. This includes a careful and serious examination, for example, of Alexei Navalny's list of kleptocrats. At the top of that list is Roman Abramovich, who is named by Alexei Navalny as one of the key enablers and beneficiaries of Russian kleptocracy. That same oligarch has significant Canadian holdings in several Western Canadian provinces. Canada's Sergei Magnitsky law allows our government to target human rights abusers with sanctions, and it also gives us a tool to hold those who violate the rule of law and enable autocrats like Putin and Lukashenko to account. Canada has the power to affect Vladimir Putin's behavior and protect those he seeks to silence. We only need to find the courage to use the tools that we have. Second, Canada should be offering a fast-track program to resettle all vulnerable Russian and Belarusian journalists and human rights activists, not just those from select subgroups that the Canadian government arbitrarily places emphasis on. When crackdowns occur, as they have in Belarus since last August elections, or elections I should put in air quotes, or in Russia over the past year, activists who face repression should be welcomed and offered refuge in this country. We shouldn't have to rely exclusively on our Baltic allies to carry that burden, as they've done for many years now. Third is, as Maria mentioned and others have, Canada is in fact a global leader in developing diversity journalism. And we should be actively supporting the development of independent Russian and Belarusian journalists and platforms as well. Canada should be working with Canadian national media and independent Russian and Belarusian heritage journalists, such as Omni Television and its roster of independent producers, to partner with Russian and Belarusian journalists who have fled their homes. In August, for example, Russian independent news channel Dozhd or TV Rain was forced off the air as a foreign agent. Our allies in Latvia have stepped up to support and offer home to other independent journalists who launched the independent Medusa platform. Canada has the experience to help both has the experience to help both Russian and Belarusian independent media like Belsat, Nexta, Tutsi, and others. Conversely, Canada should be placing sanctions on Russian and Belarusian state media platforms like Belta, which broadcast forced confessions through videos it posts on Google's YouTube. Worse yet is that YouTube and the Lukashenko regime generated revenue through advertising attached to the forced confession of Roman Protasevich last June. Sanctions on these platforms will limit their ability to promote and amplify harmful narratives intended to undermine the pro-democracy movements in those countries and spread disinformation intended to erode cohesion with our own democracy and society. Canada and our allies must do all that we can to help level the playing field in support of those Russian and Belarusian activists who courageously fight for the values that we all too often in Canada take for granted, and to give the rule of law, democracy, and human rights a fighting chance against regime that has deeply rooted themselves in corruption and repression. I'll leave it there.
Excellent, Marcus. As always, you are precisely on point in terms of what needs to be done, and like you pointed out, it's really about using the existing tools to their fullest extent and not slacking on that, or creating additional bureaucratic hurdles and paperwork and other barriers to be able to support both our allies in the region, but also those vulnerable activists, democracy and human rights activists in the region. So I think that's an excellent point to highlight. It is, I think, also important to point out here that this particular situation, both in Belarus and Russia, is where both the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, and the national interest overlaps very clearly and significantly, as we sort of highlighted here. It's not only the morally right thing to do to support those who are fighting for freedom and democracy, but also it is in our national interest to see a democratic and free Belarus and Russia, and fight against destabilizing our NATO allies by these authoritarian regimes through political warfare and subversion. So it is, in essence, a no-brainer. There is no trade-off here in terms of national interest on the one hand, and acting on the principles and right thing to do on the other. They do overlap, and we just need to take that step. We did cover a lot of the things that the audience questions that were submitted mostly dealt with. And we only have about 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do right now is to give the word back to the panelists for about 30, 45 seconds each, and ask them to give one key takeaway for the audience from this panel. If there is one sort of clear message that you would like to give, what that would be. Let me start with, in the same order again, with Maria. What's the key takeaway for you, for the audience today from this panel?
Well, Balkan, I think what you said before, we didn't really touch upon this, but I think it's really important to envision Russia without the dictator there. So there's 140 plus million people. They all want to have, a normal, and I would say European life, and they're stuck with the dictator. I think we'll have to go through Belarusian scenario as the next step. And I think people in Russia are watching Belarus very carefully because this is kind of, envision what comes next. But I think what's important is to envision what comes after this dictator. And I think Russia can be a better place and a better ally and help solve a lot of problems on the international stage. So envision Russia without Putin. That's my takeaway.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hanna.
Well, I mean, pretty much the same. I think last year people actually have chosen democracy. They voted for democracy. They voted for the democratic candidate, and they want this democracy. They're ready for it. And I think there were a lot of stereotypes, that in Belarus nothing was happening. I think how now we are surprised, right? Because this was not actually true. A lot was, the situation was boiling, and last year it exploded. Another thing that I really kind of, the stereotype that I face with is that many people compare or say that, well, Belarus and Russia is sort of the same, and kind of they often see it from the perspective of the Cold War era. Well, this is not true anymore. People don't want to be part of Russia. People in Belarus, they see their country as independent, and they never would allow this to happen. So let's not be afraid of sanctions, because sanctions are not bringing Belarus closer to the Kremlin, closer to Russia. This is something that Lukashenko is doing. And perhaps another thing is that now what we need is obviously this assistance, this support, which you mentioned, but also the prospect of prosperity, prospect of transition, and kind of this vision of a new Belarus, why people should maintain their willingness to kind of be to see their country as democratic. So here, this commitment of the European Commission to of macroeconomic assistance of 3 billion euros is important. That's something that creates, again, this dynamic inside the system, and that's something that kind of other countries should also commit with, because, well, people just need to kind of see they should be sure that they're not alone, and they should be sure that the country would not be destroyed once it is gone, because that's something that he's been talking about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Einars, 30 seconds. What's the one key takeaway for the audience from your perspective?
For the Western community, for the European Union, there are always have been two tasks maybe which are important. One we analyze today. Thank you to you for this webinar. I mean, the first is really to promote, stimulate democracy in Belarus. The second one, we should see that Belarus is sovereign, independent. So it really is important part of discussion as well. So I hope that this change which came last year, that there is a dream or a change in the souls of Belarusians, that there should be a change, that it is strong and it will continue to grow. And here, our assistance from the West, from democracies, is important to keep Belarusian issue high on international agendas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Darius, same question. What's the one key takeaway for the audience?
Yeah, I will finish with the words of prominent French diplomat, statesman, philosopher, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexis de Tocqueville, who said many years ago that democracies sometimes seem weaker than they really are. At first sight, only confusion can be seen, but deeper lies a lot of strength. So let's accumulate our strengths in supporting Belarusian civic society. Let's be together with Belarusian people.
Excellent. Marcus, the same thing. 30
All
seconds.
Right.
The key thing.
Very quickly, I'll repeat what I said before. Canada needs to work more intensely with the community of democracies, especially our Baltic allies, to support those brave activists in Belarus and Russia, people like Hannah, people like Maria, their colleagues, who are on the front lines. That may seem very distant for the Canadian government and Canadians, but that front line is shared by us. As NATO partners, we need to, our own democracy is under attack as well. That's the front line. We need to support them. We need to do a lot more, and we need to do it immediately.
Excellent. And I'd like to thank again all of the panelists for joining us, and the audience for both the questions and staying with us throughout this time. We're a little 2 minutes over, but we really appreciated you coming over and sharing your insights with us. And we hope to see you in future webinars on this issue as we continue to provide, bring the importance of our allies and our democratic partners in Europe into the Canadian public discussion. Thank you very much.